It's a couple of minutes after 10, and I want to be respectful from everyone's time. Thank you for being here today. Our goal is to share with you details and answer questions regarding the Delaware Nonprofit Support Program overview. We're very proud of our partnership with the state of Delaware, Newcastle County, the Delaware Community Foundation, Philanthropy Delaware, and United Way, who have worked over the past several months to outline this program and to put it together so that nonprofits can get some relief from the impacts of the pandemic. I have with me Jenny Brand, Vice President of Communications, Marketing Communications with Dana, and she's serving as technical backup as well as answering any questions that you might have as we go through the program. What I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to this for a little bit, and then I'm going to pause, invite questions, and then move along, because there are a couple of parts, and I recognize that with each section being a little different, give you a chance to ask your questions along the way. And certainly we have made some time at the end also for questions. I'm also thrilled that I know Yolanda Rushton from the Community Foundation is on in this session as well. So if we get to a technical question that I may not have the specifics on, I'm gonna toss it to them. So why don't we go ahead and get started?
Sheila, let me interrupt one quick second. I know everybody is tempted to place their questions in the chat box, but if you could try to remember to place them in the Q&A box, that would be very helpful. And we will try to get to everybody in this session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jenny. So let's put this in perspective before we begin. There have been a variety of different relief programs, funding opportunities for nonprofits since the pandemic began. The first is what I'll call non-governmental grant opportunities. And this is through the partnership with the United Way of Delaware, Delaware Community Foundation, Philanthropy Delaware, and Dana. We've called ourselves the COVID-19 Emergency Response Initiative. For this presentation, I'm going to just use the term the collaborative as a way to identify our four organizations, because we truly have been working in partnership with this. There were funding opportunities as part of the collaborative's work in response to the pandemic. The United Way has a rapid response fund that was targeted to early on to getting emergency relief out to support people who moved into crisis very quickly in the early weeks of the pandemic. That fund is currently on hold for distribution, and that's primarily so United Way is able to focus its resources on distributing these dollars out the door. The second funding opportunity is managed by the Delaware Community Foundation and Philanthropy Delaware, called the Strategic Response Fund, and there are two grant programs within that. The first is the Community Needs Grant, which actually wrapped up its last round on Friday of last week. That is also going to go on hold until next year, again, so that the Community Foundation staff can really focus their resources on distributing these dollars. There's also a Vision Grant program, which has its next application round ending October 14th. That program is going to continue. And so for those of you who are interested, you can visit their site to learn more about that. What we're going to spend some time talking about is governmental support programs for nonprofits. There already has been, as many of you may have benefited from, the Economic Interruption Disaster Loan Program through the Small Business Association and the PPP loans. There's the Main Street loans through the Federal Reserve, which are designed really to help those mid to larger nonprofits. And then you have funds that came through the CARES Act. And this is a federal program that distributed nearly $1 billion to the state of Delaware and about $300 million to Newcastle County. Those federal dollars do have some very specific parameters around them. And a lot of those funds were helped to use again, from that emergency response. It helped to provide funding support to hospitals and healthcare organizations during the early weeks of the pandemic. And these dollars now a portion of them are being apply towards this program that we're going to speak to. I do want to say that there could be additional federal dollars and federal support programs that will come out. The Congress has been negotiating that both on the Senate and both the Senate and the House of Representatives have put out a variety of different bills, a CARES Act 2.0, possibly another PPP loan. Just know that as that information becomes available, Dana will be sure to let you know so that you have the opportunity to take advantage of funding relief if your organization is eligible. So just a quick overview, as I mentioned, these funds for this program is jointly funded by the state of Delaware and Newcastle County. It is managed by the COVID Response Collaborative, as I mentioned. There's two parts to this program, and I'm going to walk you through each part. The first is about reimbursement for operating expenses, which the United Way will administer. And then there are capacity grants to address service increases and increased service costs that are managed by the Community Foundation and Philanthropy Delaware. We'll have 3 rounds of funding, with the first round starting October 5th. So I'd like to talk about the spirit of the program, because we're already getting some questions that folks are going, well, why isn't it this way, or why isn't it that way? The first is that the state of Delaware and Newcastle County receive these federal dollars, and so they must follow the federal guidelines, how they've interpreted them. And that's just so that they don't run into a problem when they get audited in 2021, that they somehow misspent the dollars and would have to return them. So we want to honor those federal guidelines. The second thing is that we tried to develop a program that would be open to all eligible nonprofits, and that it's non-competitive. And we've tried to create an equitable process by having 3 rounds that allows organizations that may not be ready in the first round to still have a chance to apply in future rounds. We have created maximum allowable reimbursements and grants to allow the dollars to stretch. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Dana is available to provide technical assistance at no charge to help ensure that your application is set up for success as it goes in. We are thrilled that it's $25 million. Recognize that collectively, this pandemic has impacted us at much greater levels, but we hope that these dollars will help to lighten the load a little bit as you continue to seek ways to support those you serve in the community. So a couple of eligibility considerations. First is that these are funds that are available to reimburse for expenses between March 1st and December 30th. And you'll note that at the bottom here, I say the current guidelines as of yesterday, because as I said, there are things that are in the mix that could potentially change things. We believe that any changes to these eligibility would be a good thing for nonprofits. So stay tuned, we'll certainly keep you apprised of that. There's the 2 parts, as I mentioned before, and I'll get into them later. The organization does need to have a documented incorporation date by March 1st, 2020. And the organization needs to provide services and operate in Delaware. It does not exclude a nonprofit that is incorporated in another state, but for the reimbursement, you have to be able to show that those are reimbursements for expenses that are occurring in the state of Delaware. If a nonprofit is eligible for the Delaware Relief Grants Program, which is administered by the Division of Small Business, they are not eligible for this. And this is really the state and Newcastle County wanting to make sure that there's opportunity for all of the different business segments in the state that are impacted by the pandemic. And the other thing is that expenses that have already been reimbursed or are eligible for reimbursement through government contracts and grants or through private donations or grants cannot be eligible for this program. There are a couple of categories of nonprofits based on their mission area that are not eligible. And again, this is because they have received, they're eligible for other programs or have directly received CARES Act funding. So arts, culture, hospitality nonprofits, and veteran organizations are eligible in the Delaware Relief Grant Program, so they are not eligible for this program. And hospitals and universities already have received funding through the CARES Act program. Also want to just state that childcare organizations, there was some confusion early on. Childcare organizations have benefited from a program from the state, and so they are eligible to get reimbursement for Part 1, but are not eligible for Part 2. Nonprofits that must be formed after March 1st it should say formed before March 1st. I just realized that we need to change that. And if a nonprofit didn't incur any expenses that are related to the pandemic, those also would not be eligible. So what does this look like? When we talk about Part 1, think about it as like your operating expenses. This would be expenses that your organization incurred to help your employees work safely or have to work remotely, or for your clients to be able to come to your facilities. That's kind of what we mean by operations. They're not, they're the expenses for you to be able to be open. Then you have those Part 2, which are about expenses that are related to providing services and that you had to incur costs so that your services could continue, your clients could access them, et cetera. And I will get into this in more detail, but that is allows you to apply for not only what you've already incurred, but to project what you think you're going to incur. I mentioned the 3 application rounds. And in this, because we are wanting to give everyone a shot, if you apply in round 1, you will not be able to apply again until round 3. And round 3 will be in 2021 so that it can accommodate expenses through December 30th, 2020. If for some reason there are more applications that come in than what we have for round 1 funding levels, your application will remain in the queue, so to speak, and it will become first in line for round 2. So you don't, if you end up, for whatever reason, you submitted it on, at 4 o'clock on October 16th and the funding was not eligible or available, you would move into being one of the first for round 2. The other thing to keep in mind is that because this is a first come, first serve, if your application is not complete or there's information that's inaccurate or there's questions, it will be pulled out of the line and you'll need to go back in and resubmit. So there's an incentive to make sure you've ticked and tied and had your application reviewed and it's correct ahead of time before you submit. There are also the levels of available funds range by the size of the organization. So smaller organizations under 100,000 have the opportunity for award of up to $5,000, and you can see that it scales up. One thing that we think is great is that you don't have to, the $5,000 is not for both Part 1 and Part 2 as much as it's each, so that you are able to apply for up to $5,000 in one part and up to $5,000 in another if you're a small nonprofit. However, we are capping the total amount that any one nonprofit can receive at $100,000. So let me give you some examples. So a nonprofit has a $250,000 operating budget. It can apply for up to $10,000 for reimbursement in the Part 1. And if it has documented increases in service and caseloads, they can also apply for $10,000 in Part 2. Nonprofit with $3 million, they can apply for up to $50,000 to be reimbursed for Part 1. And if they also experience increased service costs related to the pandemic, they can apply for additional $50,000. A $10 million nonprofit can apply for up to $75,000 in Part 1, but because there is that max cap of $100,000, they would only be able to apply for up to $25,000 in Part 2. So we hope that this creates some flexibility so that as you look at your organizational expenses directly related to this pandemic, that you are able to portfolio manage this between the two parts. There is great concern that a nonprofit does not submit requests that they've already been funded for. And again, just reiterating that includes any government source of funds as well as private funds, and including insurance proceeds. As part of the application, you will need to attest that they have not been funded somewhere else. And just know that there is a process in place for behind the scenes where the collaborative is working with the government agencies that have offered these different grant programs to do some verification. So just want to put that out there. Again, that's part of those guidelines that the state and Newcastle County don't want to find themselves down the road that they compensated someone for the same expenses twice. So I'll give you some examples again. A nonprofit with that $250,000 budget spent $15,000 on operational expenses related to COVID-19. They were fortunate to receive a grant from the Strategic Response Fund for 10, which means then that they could apply for $5,000 in Part 1. A nonprofit with a $10 million budget, let's assume that they receive a government contract for food assistance, but that contract doesn't cover volunteer mileage, which cost $5,000 above its regular budgeted levels because of the pandemic. So that nonprofit would be able to apply for that $5,000 expense, not for the food and not for the portion of the expense that they had already budgeted, but for that incremental increase in costs. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions there are before I move into more details about Part 1 and Part 2.
Hi, Sheila. So I'm going to read Laura's question, which I think we may have addressed, but it says, if my organization has already applied for CARES money through Newcastle County, can we also apply through this fund?
You can, but you cannot apply for the same expenses.
And Dawn had a similar question, wondering if, am I understanding this correctly, the organizations that receive the PPP and or the SBA EIDL will not qualify for this grant?
You're making an assumption. One part you cannot apply staffing expenses, another part you will be able to, and I'll get into that.
And then Casey has a question of, is the funding cap per cycle, question mark? For example.
No, it's in total. So if you applied, let's say your organization is eligible for $10,000, and in round 1 you applied for $2,500, and then in round 3 you applied for $7,500, then you've met your cap.
Okay, I think that answers it. Oh, nope, sorry, got another one here. Will we be able to print a copy of our application once it's submitted?
I am not sure about that. I'm wondering if Yolanda, would you be able to bring Yolanda up so she could answer that question?
Hi, it's Yolanda.
Hi, Yolanda.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, there will be a PDF of the application available on the DCF's website, and then so that you can look at it beforehand. And once you push submit, you will be able to print the application as well. And you can go back to it on our portal to view it.
Thank you. Any other questions, Jenny?
Yes, we have, Anne would like to know, so round 1 deals with expenses related to the safety of employees and clients exclusively, correct?
No. The rounds are different than the parts. The rounds are the schedule of when you can apply. The parts, think of them as almost like 2 separate programs with 2 separate parts of the bigger program that have different requirements and different eligibilities, which I'll be going into.
And the last question, oh, nope, we got 2 more. If we have seen an increased need for mental health purposes, would that apply to phase 2?
I will get into phase 2. So how about we hold that question and I can answer it then.
And right now, the last one we have is, we are an educational nonprofit. Our expenses have increased in relation to providing materials to teachers and parents trying to cope with the needs of virtual classes? I'm not sure that was an exact question, but I think what she's asking is that qualifies.
Yeah, so I'm going to get into what qualifies in part one, and then I'll pause again. So if you have more questions, then I can answer them then.
I think we're all wrapped up for now then. So let's
right.
keep moving.
Okay, this is a long list, and we do have, we created a website, decaresfunds.org, which has all of the available funding opportunities for nonprofits due to COVID-19 that either are the collaborative or the government are offering. And so you can visit that site because we do have FAQs and we do list a lot of this information so that you can go back to it. In addition, this webinar will be, a recording of the webinar will be posted, and we also can send out the PowerPoint to registrants so that you have this information. Again, just a caveat, this is as of, yesterday afternoon. So these are the expenses. So you can see here, there's quite a large range of categories. We're thrilled with this. When we first started our conversations, we were hoping that we could get reimbursed for PPE and disinfecting equipment, but as the government began to understand what they could do, they really worked with us to expand those eligible expenses. The key here is to think about it is, these are expenses that you did not have in your budget as of March 27th and happened because of the pandemic, between March 1st and December 30th. So if you were already planning to buy laptops, that doesn't count in your budget. If you were planning to buy 5 laptops, but you had to buy 10 so that your employees could work remotely, those extra 5 would be considered an increase. And hopefully that makes sense. What is required to apply for Part 1? Again, I really commend the United Way and the Delaware Community Foundation and Philanthropy Delaware. They've really worked hard to try to make this a simple application, but also to meet the requirements for compliance and review, so that if in the future there was any audits again, that we'd have all the documentation. So for Part 1, you'll need to just type in the date of your 501c3 incorporation, the dollar value of your operating budget, and your NTE code. These are codes that the government created to classify nonprofits. And if you're not sure of your code, you can click, there's going to be a link in the application that you can click on it and you can look for your category. If you recall, the Delaware Relief Grant, that is for small businesses, reference a different kind of code called an NAIC code. That's the government's approach for segmenting businesses, but it was felt that that did not appropriately meet the classifications of nonprofits, and that's why the NTE codes were created. Hopefully that makes sense. You will need to also include your most recent IRS tax filing. If you are a nonprofit that doesn't file a 990, or you're so new, you didn't even file a tax form yet, your most recent operating budget can be submitted. Your most recent audit, the IRS determination letter, and of course, receipts. What is not eligible in Part 1? Unfortunately, we cannot get reimbursed at this time for this program for reimbursement for lost revenue. Also, if your nonprofit was eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program, eligible, you might have chosen not to do it, but it's about eligibility. You cannot use, you cannot request reimbursement for salaries or benefits or any staffing costs in Part 1. As mentioned before, any expenses or donated dollars or items that were covered by a government or a private donation cannot be included in this program. Expenses not relevant or related to the COVID-19. If you got damages by reimbursed by insurance, you can't use those. General capital improvement projects. I've we wanted to be mindful that things like technology, computers, in some cases, a nonprofit might have had to physically redesign their internal space so that their employees and their clients could safely work or be together. You know, those capital expenses would be eligible. But if you were planning to, wow, this is a great opportunity for us to expand our space, or gee, we have a capital campaign going on, we'd like to apply for that. This is not for this. Keep it very specific to reimbursement and expenses incurred because of the pandemic. And of course, any costs prior to March 1st and any costs after December 30th would not be eligible. So here's an example of the schedule for completing part 1. You can see, and this is an Excel spreadsheet that you will be able to download, and we will make it available in advance, as Yolanda mentioned, so that you can fill it out. So you would be listing the vendor's name, what you purchased. The expense type is kind of going back to those expenses that are eligible, so that you can just quickly say, oh, it's PPE. How you paid for it, when you paid for it, how much, and the dollar amount. And you would itemize them, and then you have a receipt for each of those items in the same order that you put on the spreadsheet. Because we recognize that sometimes you get grant funding and you might apply a portion of the grant money, let's say, to an expense, you can deduct your grant or your contract and show them what the net is. So again, try to find a way to make this easy for you to explain the unreimbursed expenses that you're using for this program. If you are a nonprofit that currently receives federal dollars through either grants or contracts, and you're applying to this program, check with your accountant just to make sure that the amount you receive doesn't put you over a new threshold that would increase your audit requirements. So that's just a little FYI for those nonprofits with federal contracts and grants. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions popped up. And if I didn't answer your question before, feel free to ask it again.
Hi, everybody. So Dawn has a quick question about, we were advised as a church we would not need a 501c3 since they're a church. Is the actual 501c3 required for churches?
So for you to be designated as a charitable organization or charitable nonprofit, you do need to have an IRS incorporation document, and a lot of churches do. What churches are not required to do is to file a tax form 990. So in that case, if you were applying here, you would need to submit your operating budget as a proxy to the 990. But if you do not have a 501c3 status, unfortunately, you cannot apply in this program.
So Sheila, I'm going to have to say you're doing a good job, because that's it for questions right now. So let's dive into part 2.
Oh, wow. Okay. So again, the application allows you to apply. It's a common application. So that's another thing I commend the Community Foundation United Way, so that if you wanted to apply just for part 1 or just for part 2, you can, but you can also apply for both using the same application. So part 2. Part 2 is more, it's still a reimbursement, but because it does allow you to project out your future anticipated expenses, we called it a capacity grant for part 2. And this is for those documented increase in costs associated with expanded service offerings, caseloads, and other service cost increases attributable to the pandemic. They are again for expenses between that March 1st and December 30th. And they do need to be expenses that were not incurred or you did not anticipate to be incurred in the budget that you had as of March 27th, 2020. We are allowing you to forward project. So for example, if traditionally you served 50 clients a month and that's what you budgeted, and for the months between March and September, you went up to 100 clients, those extra 50 clients and the costs associated with them could be reimbursed. But because you've been basically double the number of clients, you could say, and we expect that we're going to have double the clients for the rest of the year, and it would cost us this much. That becomes your grant application. You would get a payment for the portion that you've already expensed, and then in 2021, you will get a second payment to cover the remaining balance, because again, from a reporting standpoint, they want to just make sure that your assumptions were correct. There's a review committee, and this review committee is comprised of representatives from all 3 counties, from the state of Delaware, Newcastle County, and the 4 organizations as part of the collaborative. This is not a competitive review committee as much as a compliance review. There will be individuals who are receiving the applications in and then doing a quick verification that the applications are eligible, they're complete, there's no questions there. And then this review council is verifying that the application and the requested expenses do fulfill the guidelines and are within the guidelines of the grant program. One of the things that was important for the state and for Newcastle County was a recognition that there are a lot of people who are negatively impacted by the pandemic. And so they did make a point that, you know, when you think about this part of the program, it's really for those services for people in need. And so when you see the list, you can kind of get an idea of the types of services that are eligible. So again, tried to keep it as broad as possible, but also to be mindful that this is really about pandemic relief, not only for the organizations that serve people, but for the people that they serve. And again, this list is on the FAQ section of decaresfunds.org. So what is required to apply for Part 2? Again, you won't have to fill out your 501c3 twice if you've applied for Part 1. So the first section of the application is the same application, just like Part 1's application. There are three different areas, though, that are different, and this really gets into, first, documenting the increase in services and service costs, and then documenting what those costs are. So I'm going to walk you through an example. Actually, I'm going to walk you through a couple examples to help out. So this is an example of a nonprofit that provides meals at their location. So the first question will be, what are the services and how have those services increased? In this case, the nonprofit has had to switch from to carry out meals and to actually deliver meals at home. So those are clearly expanded services because they're not asking people to come to them, they're going to them, and there'd be some costs associated with that. The next is, okay, well, how do you document your expanded service or those changes? In this case, it's number of meals, number of miles. And then what are the incremental increases in those services? So you would show, we typically have no mileage expense because people come to our place. And now we are reimbursing our staff and our volunteers to deliver meals. And so it's this cost between March 1st and December 30th or September, whichever timeline you're using. And it might also be that you had already planned for the food. It's just that now the food is not happening in the location, it's being delivered. So there's extra costs associated with packaging, maybe coolers and other types of things to help make sure the food remains edible and safe to be delivered to those who need it. And so what are those costs? And so this again would be expenses incurred for that incremental aspect of your services. So you can't put in, if you were already budgeted to purchase food for this service, you can't include that food, but you can include those expenses that were required in order for you to deliver the food. Similarly, if you used to have all volunteers that were working in the kitchens and now you have to hire or contract staff because of the safety requirements, and those staff were not covered through the PPP loan, this is an example where you can use personnel expenses. But want to stress that it's really important that these are not staffing expenses that were reimbursed through your Paycheck Protection Program. And as a reminder that you can include not only what you expensed through September, but you can forecast what you believe you're going to need March through December, so that as long as it doesn't exceed what your maximum eligibility is, you would have that available for a second reimbursement in 2021. So I'm going to give you a couple more examples. This is actually my, oh, I just realized this is 75 nonprofits per month. It's supposed to be 75 clients per month. But this gives you an example of a mental health organization that had ongoing average number of clients. They had an increase in the number of clients, so the costs associated with those 25 extra clients will be covered. If this mental health agency gets reimbursed through some type of insurance for 50% of those 25 people, then they could only apply for the half that they didn't get reimbursed for. Here's an example of the meal example that I gave previously. So just another example. It's an easy one to use as an example, I have to admit. After school. So nonprofits that support, 25 youth after school. In the early weeks of the pandemic, these kids were not getting their free lunches. They were not getting their breakfast. And so the youth organization may have gone out and purchased food until the families were networked into a food distribution system. So those are definitely an increased, expanded service that nonprofit incurred for the purposes of food assistance. And so that could be included if they did not budget to pay for food in the past. Another example, if a nonprofit transitioned their programs to online and they spent $5,000 in technology, and the number of people that they serve that go to visit their programs online has doubled, this is really not eligible for Part 2. The only way it could be is if you had to increase your staffing to support that increased demand. Really, we would suggest that you use Part 1 for this, and that way there won't be concerns or questions that might emerge around if that really is truly an increased service. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. And I encourage you, if you're not sure about something, please email us. On the decaresfunds.org, there is a contact us link where you can either ask a quick question. There's also a form that you can fill out if you would like somebody to review your application ahead of time, or you want to get something confirmed. Our goal in this process is to help you get a clean application through so that you can get those funds reimbursed. So I'll stop there. And Jenny, what questions may have come forward?
So we have several this time. So let me start with Leslie's question. It goes back to Part 1, but she says, if special cleaning processes are needed and you sign a contract in 2020, but it wouldn't occur until 2021, is that eligible?
Unfortunately, no. This is very much about the expenses that you incurred, not ones that you may be liable for. So that's actually, if you're a nonprofit that's used to using accrual-based accounting, typically you would recognize if you had an invoice. In this process, you have to actually have spent the money through, cash, check, credit card. It can't be invoices. It's going to have to be receipts.
Great, thank you. Anne asked, and I think this is an easy answer for you, can you apply to Part 1 and Part 2 in the same cycle?
Yes. And just a reminder that you can't exceed, so if your organization is under 100,000, you can't exceed 5,000 in Part 1 and 5,000 in Part 2.
So Abby would like to know, what if we need to pay rent for space to be able to hold programming? We currently borrow space from locations that are no longer allowing outside groups in. Is this eligible in Part 2?
That's a good question. If you could email that one to us at decaresfunds.org, we'll get the answer. That's an example similar to the example of volunteer staff, but now you have to pay for employee staff. So we'll get that answer for you.
Jocelyn wants to know, can a nonprofit preschool apply for operational expenses in Part 1? I know schools, or at least schools with paid tuition, have not been eligible in the past.
Again, you can apply for things like PPE because of the way in which some child care centers are getting some additional funding. That's where this sensitivity is. You can't apply for Part 2 related expenses.
Okay, so Krista would like to know, for Part 1, is there a date that the purchases and receipts need to be completed by?
December 30th, 2020.
Okay, let's see. Laura says, if an organization was eligible for PPP loan but did not receive any funding, are staff costs for increased services still eligible for Part 2?
In Part 2, yes, as long as you verify that the increased staff expense was, again, because of the pandemic, and you were not able to get that reimbursed through any other program, including the PPP.
Let's see. Janine would like to know, can a family displaced from housing be provided with a motel room or other short-term housing costs?
This program is not directly funding individuals. It is going to nonprofits that have increased expenses. We had a similar question last evening that we have sent to the state to get clarification, which is around mortgage relief expenses and vouchers. So we will get that information. But if your organization had to spend money above and beyond what you would normally spend to support individuals who needed housing, as long as you did not get reimbursed in another way through either a government fund or a private fund, in theory, they would be eligible, but we'll get a more specific answer. Again, if you don't mind emailing us that way we don't miss that question when we send our requests up to the state.
And just to repeat the email, that's decaresfunds@delawarenonprofit.org. That's the email address. So Anne would like to know, what about expenses incurred because we have to go from an in-person event to a virtual event? The event is an equity symposium that had already been planned.
I would first say that were those costs incremental, and then I would say that if that is a program, not a service, so I'm not sure that Part 2 is eligible. I would say that it's possible Part 1, but again, we could get some more clarity around that. That's a good question. That'll probably apply to a lot of organizations.
And it looks like Casey has a question of, do we need specific documentation such as contracts, invoices, over and above, I believe, the receipts and whatnot?
For Part 1, you need to provide the receipts. There's no, I would say that if you may want to hold on to any documentation on other funding that you might have gotten from government in case there is an audit down the road. For Part 2, we are not asking for receipts just because of the variability of what could be included there, but we do encourage you to hold on to those receipts if down the road an audit takes place and you're requested to show them. I believe that, and this is Yolanda, let me point this to you. Am I correct that there is an option that if a nonprofit wishes to submit documentation for Part 2 beyond the 2 schedules, they can do that?
That's a good question, and I need to check the application. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let me check the application.
Okay, so the guidance right now is make sure you've got those receipts in a good place so that if somebody comes back in the future and says, can you show me receipt for line 3 on your expense schedule, you've got it for Part 2.
Okay, so it looks like we can keep going.
Okay, great. So considerations for a complete application. There are not many, quite frankly, again, this was designed to try to be as simple as possible. But there are a couple places where you do need to give a short narrative. And I encourage you to be very concise and explain your information. Don't assume the reviewers know what you're talking about. No alphabet language, spell things out so that it is clear, so that the reviewers don't have to say, I don't know, and then send it back. Make sure that your receipts for part 1 are in the same order as they are on the schedule. That will, again, allow the reviewers to very quickly compare, verify that you have the receipts, and then pass it on. The application will only permit one PDF for all the receipts that you're submitting for part 1. And so I encourage you, if you don't have that form of Adobe that allows you to combine PDFs, that's something that Dana can help you with. You just submit a request and we can quickly help combine your PDFs so that you can submit it as one document. Keep to eligible expenses. Try not to create a lot of gray areas, because if you submit something and it has to get reviewed or go back to the state, that could hold you up and possibly even kick you out. So I would encourage you, I think that many of us have expenses that fall in those very clean categories, and encourage you to try to stay there. Make sure, I know this seems kind of academic, but really important, please double check that the amount that you've put on the application that you're asking to get reimbursed and the total on your expense schedules match. Again, if they don't, that's a good sign that it's going to get kicked back to you and you'll have to resubmit. There's no reason why you can't get help for this. We have several consultants who have been designated to support you. They're available now so that we can start helping folks get their applications processed. Again, if you just want somebody to review it to make sure you've got a second set of eyes, we're happy to do that. If you need help filling out your schedule, or if you're an organization that you might not have your budget formatted in a way that a reviewer can look at, we really try to put together a collection of technical assistance that can help you with whatever you're looking for. So please feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to get back to you very quickly. So again, that decaresfunds.org, we've designed that, so that's the landing page for the FAQs. Again, this is as of today. The federal government is still exploring some additional relief programs, which may cause them to expand the CARES Act program in some way. So if we find out that there's new news, we will be sure to make sure that you're made aware of it. And again, I just want to thank our partners in this program, and for the state of Delaware and Newcastle County for understanding and supporting nonprofits and the important work that they're doing out in around the state. So with that, I'll stop again to see if there are other questions.
So we have one more. Abby would like to know if there is a schedule created that they can plug into, or if they need to create their own.
Yes, those schedules will be available when the application's available. If they're finalized before then, we will put them on the decaresfunds.org website, and so that way you have them in advance. We would prefer you use the schedules so that the reviewers are not having to interpret any information that you send.
Okay, so I will give a last call for questions. Oh, we got one more. Leslie just says thank you for the training. It's very valuable.
Thank you, Leslie.
So I think we're all set.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again. Good luck, and please don't hesitate to ask. These are federal government dollars, and for those of you who've worked with government, you know that they are very specific. So we want to make sure that you are getting the help you need and that we can get this through. And please, if you're not sure if something's eligible, better get that answer before you apply. So send us your questions, and we have folks at the state who are running them up to because the Department of Justice actually verifies these expenses just to make sure that it doesn't violate the CARES Act federal guidelines. So it takes us a day or two to get an answer, but we will get back to you. Thank you.
One last question. Wait, one last question.
Okay.
I apologize. Anne says, how can Part 2 ongoing expenses qualify for Part 1 already? Wait, how can Part 2 ongoing expenses qualify for Part 1 already expended expenses?
You can't put in Part 2 expenses that you incurred and that you applied for in Part 1. If I'm understanding the question. Think about it as expenses that you incurred to deliver the services that increased or the costs increased because of the pandemic, where Part 1 is really about your operations. You know, the costs associated with creating a safe work environment, the costs associated with allowing your employees to be able to work remotely during this time. Those, you know, that's kind of the distinction. Think about operations, and Part 2 is about services and programs.
So one more question from Scott, and he wants to know when the application will be online. And I think you said that earlier, but I think it bears repeating.
October 5th is when the application will be online.
I think we are good.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time today. I hope that you have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.